Hello there, Mandy here. Restorative Grief with Mandy Capehart is not just a podcast. It's also a book, a free online grief group, and a one-on-one private coaching practice. If you are interested in learning more, visit mandykapehart.com to find out how restorative grief can help you heal heart, mind, body, and spirit. Welcome back to Restorative Grief with Mandy Capehart. You are listening to episode 207, titled Is It Fear or Love with Brandan Robertson. What can queer theology teach all of us about healing from spiritual harm, reclaiming identity, and finding faith beyond the binaries? In this episode, I am joined by Reverend Brandan Robertson, a leading voice in queer theology and inclusive faith practices. Together, we are exploring the intersections of grief, identity, and community loss and spiritual transformation, especially for those who have been pushed to the margins of religious spaces. So whether or not you identify as queer, this conversation holds space for the kind of honesty, self-compassion, and spiritual reclamation that we all need when confronting systems and spaces that no longer serve our wholeness. Brandan shares with depth and clarity what it means to live authentically, to hold space for grief, and to continue working toward liberation, both personally and collectively. Hey everybody, welcome back to Restorative Grief with Mandy Capehart. I am your host, Mandy, and today we're talking about the way we carry grief in our lives when our very identities are threatened and diminished. I have the honor of hosting author, theologian, activist, and TikTok pastor, Reverend Brandan Robertson, whose work centers liberation and transformation through the lens of inclusive faith. His latest book is titled Queer and Christian: Reclaiming the Bible, Our Faith, and Our Place at the Table. Brandan, welcome to Restorative Grief.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here with you.
Yeah, and I love that you're here on a grief podcast because there is so much intersection between my work as a grief educator and yours as a pastor and a writer, creating space for healing and wholeness in the aftermath and the ongoing religious harm and exclusion and identity suppression that people deal with. In your work, you hold space for people who are navigating that pain and being pushed out to the margins of their faith communities. I'm curious about your own grief experience and how that has shown up in your journey and how you see it shaping the healing work that you're called into.
Yeah, I mean, what's so interesting, but also not, it's a regular pattern, is that I've been doing this work for a little bit over a decade now. And if you would have asked me just 5 years ago, I would have told you that I didn't have religious trauma, that I didn't actually carry any of the wounds and scars from getting outed publicly, from being rejected by my church, from doing conversion therapy, all of which I did in my coming out journey. But then I actually got into some therapy and I also stepped away from ministry for about 2 years. And it was in that period that I really began to realize how deeply wounding not just the experience of rejection, that of course is harmful, but the theology that I had been indoctrinated with as a young person and I grasped onto so sincerely actually embedded itself in my subconscious in a way that even today, as somebody who's very progressive and has done a lot of work to reconstruct my faith, I still find it cropping up in dark moments or down times. And I have questions about the judgment of God or about my fundamental lovability as a human, or if I'm disappointing God or the community that gave me hope and a purpose as a young person. I know the answers to those questions, right? But in my own psychological work that I've done, I experience grief and fear and anxiety very somatically. And so I just started noticing the ways anxiety lived in my body anytime I really was confronted with somebody with more conservative beliefs, when I heard a conservative televangelist on TV for a brief moment. Like all of that has this very triggering reality that I kind of buried down for so long. But it's really helped me to understand so many of the people that have sat in front of me. I mean, my story is that I grew up in a conservative religious environment, ended up going off to Moody Bible Institute, which is a conservative evangelical school. And I thought I was going to become an evangelical pastor and that God was going to heal me in 4 short years. But what happened in college was that I started reading the Bible and Bible scholarship. I started going out into the city of Chicago and finding God in all the places my theology said God wasn't supposed to be. And I would bring that back to my campus and explore that. I had a blog and a podcast and just on conversations on the dorm floor. And I was met with fear. 4 times or 6 times over 4 years, I was threatened with expulsion from my college, not because I was breaking any of the ethical rules, simply because I was questioning theological paradigms. And then when I confessed that I was struggling with homosexuality at the time, my college dean invited me to his office and said, "We don't want you to leave here and start waving rainbow flags." Those were his exact words. And so they
Wow.
invited me to do a year of conversion therapy to prove my fidelity to the faith that I was being trained in. And the long story short is, at the end of those 4 years, I really came to the place where I recognized the tradition I was a part of wasn't rooted in the God whose nature is love, which is what the scripture says, but rather in fear and a imperative to conform in order to belong and be loved, which is the exact opposite of the message of Jesus. It's the exact opposite of the gospel in the New Testament. But again, the journey, even after that realization, out of that environment, um, caused so much trauma because Christianity in that form was the only world I knew. It was the foundation of my life. It was the community. It was my hope and my future.
Yeah.
And so to be forced out of that community, to be told I was a heretic and a deceiver and a false teacher, which again, so many queer people hear similar things. Um, that carried such spiritual and psychological weight. It made me really question my heart's intent, whether I was fundamentally good or fundamentally evil. And that stuff really, I mean, weighs on the subconscious in tremendous ways. And it has taken over a decade to even begin to start working through that.
Yeah. Well, and that's just such a spotlight on the theological certainty that people are very, very married to intellectually, and equally how disconnected they are from, like, the dissonance that we feel in our bodies when we say it's this or that, it's black and white. There is only certainty. And, when you say we're being motivated by fear and not by love, I think of that often. And that is how I even overlay my own concerns, my own questions about anything. Is this a motivation of fear that's asking this question? Is this a motivation of love that's moving me toward that? And I think that what you're describing too is just that rigid experience where people are so afraid for themselves, for their own understanding to be challenged, to be pushed away, that they cannot even fathom that someone around them could be softening toward themselves or rebuilding something a little more honest. How did you um, begin to incorporate grief work and that somatic awareness of your body and how it was experiencing the loss of what was going on into your growth after you left?
Yeah, I mean, I've struggled with anxiety and depression for a very long time. I had a very abusive, alcoholic father and a very rough upbringing. And so started having lots of anxiety live in my body in really physical ways from around 12 years old onward. And the church actually became one of the places that helped me deal with and overcome, in some ways, the experience of anxiety because it gave me a paradigm to believe in that told me that there was a God who was with me and loved me. And at a young age, especially, you feel that in a very real way. I was just writing about this today for my next book, and I talk about like the feeling of Santa Claus, right? Not to dumb it down, but to say like for a child who believes in Santa Claus, there's nothing more real and nothing more exciting than that on Christmas Eve. And then when that goes away, there's actually a very real grief and you lose a sense of magic and grounding in the world. Well, that times 10 is what so many people experience when they begin to recognize that the God and the community and the theology that gave you purpose, meaning, and stability in the world doesn't have room for you because you're queer. And that opened up a whole new realm of anxiety manifestations. I mean, while I was in Bible college, uh, I went to the emergency room by ambulance, very expensive, about 4 times, so almost once a year, because of panic attacks. And I didn't know what was happening at the time. And I had not yet been on antidepressants or had any psychological treatment. But looking back now, I can see that an environment that's constantly closing in on you as a queer person, and me trying to repress that and ask God to take that away, that only could manifest somatically in my body. It had no other way to come out, and it caused a great deal of trauma and harm to me. It made me feel very sick and out of body in many ways. And the way that I've incorporated that, I mean, I still am very candid. I struggle with anxiety. I see my therapist every week. I'm still going to psychiatrists and trying out different medications. I think all of that is wonderful. And yet, the more I've been able to get the opportunity, and I think this is one of the blessings of kind of the public work that I get to do, the more I've gotten to share my story and the experience of rejection and the experience of fear of God and the ways that that manifests. I mean, I get hundreds of emails every year and meet hundreds of people on the road who are going through the same thing. And as trite as it might sound, when you're especially in this religious trauma space, you really don't imagine that other people experience this.
Yeah.
It really does, even when you don't believe in it anymore, you still have this like Satan versus God thing going on, and this must be some spiritual battle where I'm on the wrong end.
Yeah.
And getting to share that, I found that there are so many thousands of people that have this, not even LGBT people, people have their own version of religious trauma for different reasons. And that has actually become so empowering to me to know that if I stand up and share my experience, one, it takes away some of the power of the experience, but two, to find this cohort of people that are also going through this very real grief and loss of a community that they really loved, but are also working to build a spirituality that works for them and can actually lead them towards healing. And I think that's really one of the only reasons I still do this work, despite still getting hate nearly daily from the conservative Christians, because I know that so many on that conservative side are actually just there because of fear. And one day that fear is going to break, and they're going to need not me, but voices like this and people who are talking about this stuff in order to find a healing path.
Well, and that you just beautifully described this thread that you have throughout your whole book, too, about this desire for normalcy, this idea that there is a normal that has always been and will always be that conservationist mindset that says this is what needs to happen and anything that differs from this is dangerous or reckless. And I feel like I see that constantly in grief work, of course, as well, right? Nobody wants gray space. Nobody wants to experience or even name anxiety as something that could be going on in their life because that points to something being abnormal, as if that were deeply problematic on all fronts. And I just think that being familiar with normalcy to the degree that we're obsessed and we're fighting to protect it holds us back in our journeys, whether that's toward healing for a loss of life or a relationship or even just exploring our identity. How do you see that?
Yeah, I love that. That was so beautifully said. And that's exactly what I'm getting at in this book. This is not just a book about how to be queer and Christian, that's a part of it. But what I really talk about in this book is how the definition of queer, I quote Bell Hooks in the first chapter, who says that being queer is not so much who you're having sex with, but being at odds with everything and everyone around you. Queerness, I actually think, is the invitation of the Christian faith in its authentic form. The Apostle Paul writes, "Be not conformed to the image of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind."
Yep.
In my understanding, that's an invitation to resist the forces of this world that are trying to make you something or someone other than who God authentically created you to be, which is unique and different and quirky and queer. All of us are queered in our most authentic selves, but all of us live in a culture, society, or family that says you have to put on masks to fit in. You have to fit into boxes in order to get ahead. And this book really became a journey for me to invite even heterosexual, cisgender, straight people to be queered, to say that the path to your liberation is to wake up to the fact that you too have been being forced to conform to ways of being that aren't authentic to you. And that always will manifest in some sort of spiritual, psychological dysfunction in our lives. I truly believe that. And again, it's been the joy of pastoring. Like the church I'm at now is primarily heterosexual people, but getting to sit down with them as a queer person, share my journey of repression and suppression and the ways religion did that to me. I've gotten to see in real time how men in my church have said, "Oh my goodness, I've always liked these quote unquote feminine things, whether it's music or theater or whatever." And I was forced to cut that off at a young age.
Yeah.
And even something as simple as that has psychological repercussions. And so the freedom to say, actually, you can explore that, you can love that, you can dress like that, is just a gateway, I think, into opening up a space where true healing and wholeness can emerge.
I love that you presented it that way. And I, of course, clapped with the bell hooks opening because I thought this book, and as I finished it, I thought this is essential reading for anyone who feels connected to the Christian faith in any way. Because if we are truly committed to pursuing truth and embodying the way of Christ, the voices you're highlighting, the words that you share in the work and here are revealing just how quickly we are willing to conform to our culture around us and cut ourselves off from possibility, from transformation, from creative inclusion of who we are and how we express ourselves. And going back to what you said about, even though I may not hold on to that truth, it's still in the back of the brain, right? Immediately the memorized verse, which I won't repeat correctly anyway, comes up as like, oh, but what about the flesh? At what point are we just following our flesh, right? There's always a but what about
Yeah.
argument when you are recognizing where spirituality has been weaponized to cause harm and to cause you to carve away a piece of your identity that is not doing harm to anyone or anything.
Yeah. I'm going to nerd out for just a second, so forgive me, everyone. But
No forgiveness. We want it.
well, because it's so interesting, your point about the flesh and the ways that that is demonized in some of the New Testament, that has hurt women and queer people and lots of people in lots of ways. It's caused so much of Christian theology to demonize sex altogether, even though the Bible itself has no condemnation explicitly of premarital sex or various sexual relationships. What's so fascinating is in the Bible, you see this split between Jesus and that early Christian theology, which is that God cares about humanity and our bodies so much that God becomes a human, which is a revolutionary concept in world religion. That was not something that had ever happened until the Jesus moment. It's a theological anomaly. And the early Christians, if you read some of that writing, they had this deep understanding that faith was experiential. God was with us in our flesh. The experience was not one of putting off the desires of the flesh, but it was aligning our desires to what leads us to wholeness, the kingdom of God, as Jesus put it. But then you
Mm-hmm.
have the Apostle Paul who comes on later, and Paul is influenced by Greek philosophy, and Greek philosophy, Stoicism, demonized the body, demonized desire, demonized flesh. And it's really there that you begin hearing so much of this idea that there's a war between flesh and spirit, this dualism. Christ and early Judaism of the first century was not inherently dualistic. It was standing against that and saying we are integrated beings. Our experience should be integrated in the world. And then you had Greek philosophy coming in saying, actually, we're not integrated beings. The flesh is evil, the spirit is good. And it's just wild that that is the message that has generally won out throughout Christianity and has left so many lives in its wake because people have been taught to fear their desires, fear what brings pleasure, fear the body. When the entirety of John chapter 1 is that God became flesh and made his dwelling among us, and we're invited to experience the divine in our flesh, through our bodies, to embrace the fullness of who we are in our incarnated state. Um, yeah, I just wanted to say that because I think it's wild, and most people don't get to hear that distinction, I think, in churches.
Well, and I think too, because what you're asking is people to go along a little bit deeper than a Sunday morning sermon. You're
Yeah.
asking people to trust their understanding of theology or even the practice of reading the Bible for more than just 20 minutes with a cute little devotional. And I say that as someone who basically wrote a grief devotional. I
Yeah.
have great respect for the systems and the ways the tools that we use to get ourselves into what we would consider a healthier habit for our life. But it also tends to dull our human curiosity, tends to dampen our voracious desire to learn more and to ask questions and to become comfortable with a non answer, to be
Mm.
satisfied recognizing, oh, damn, Paul is kind of disagreeing with Jesus here. Who do I pick? Oh, I can keep both. I can
Yeah.
actually live a both and faith.
Mm.
Fascinating. And we don't have, you know, a culture that allows much for both and thinking. And that was something I really appreciated about your book as well. This undercurrent of hope that is born out of that survival of what you've experienced, but also resisting a flattening of the faith that
Mm.
has grown and the identity that has grown. And I'm curious because every time I approach my own faith, these are the questions that come back around. Can I maintain dimension in this? Can I stay connected and hopeful and curious in the face of ongoing systemic harm that I witness, of supporting my friends who are queer, who are being oppressed and controlled? How do you hold on to hope in the middle of all of this?
Yeah. I mean, again, this might sound like a kitschy answer, but I do think it's true that there needs to be a separation of our spirituality, of our relationship with God, however you might put that,
Mm-hmm.
from the institutions that claim to represent God. One of my favorite scriptures comes from the book of Acts, and I believe it was the Apostle Stephen who says, God does not dwell in temples made by human hands. The
Mm-hmm.
idea that we can confine God to rules, to a book, to an institution, that is the primary means of control of, I think, toxic religion. And it's also where people get the most harm done to them because they have such a narrowed image of God that they have figured out that their pastor has told them all the attributes of God. In that system, there's a lot of comfort, there's a lot of safety, but there's also, again, fear is the boundary. Everything around that is fear. What's giving me hope is that once you take a step outside the boundary, which is the most terrifying thing many people will ever do, you'll find that the God Jesus speaks about, as in John chapter 3, Jesus says, the Spirit is like the wind. No one knows from where it comes or where it goes. The Hebrew Bible talks about, my ways are not your ways, my thoughts are not your thoughts, says the Lord. The whole idea of the divine is that God is above anything we could conceive of, speak, or say, and that God's fundamental nature throughout the New Testament is love, mercy. Jesus says God stands all day long with his arms outstretched to a disobedient people. The idea is that God is both bigger and more expansive than we could ever imagine, so we should get comfortable acknowledging that every word that we speak about God is likely wrong, it's likely inaccurate. And the one thing we can know about God, because I think we can experience it spiritually, but also because our tradition and our scripture has said this, is that God's disposition towards us is a loving parent. And loving parents don't judge their children when they mess up, they seek to restore their children. Loving parents don't cast their children into eternal conscious torment if they don't believe the right things. They seek to guide their children onto the right path. Um, People are waking up to that reality or a more expansive reality of God. I think the whole deconstruction movement that we're seeing in this moment is evidence of that. I think the propensity of people talking about religious trauma and healing and finding new paths, that's not something that was actually very prominent 10 years ago.
Right.
Um, and so I'm just really hopeful that in this moment, people are being brave and speaking out about their religious experience. But it's not just the kind of new atheist thing of 20 years ago where it's just like, screw all religion, it's all evil. People are actually taking a more integrated approach and saying, actually, I can hold the mystery and majesty of spirituality and of God and begin to feel free enough to create a religion that works for me, a spirituality that works for me. And that might cost me relationships, it might cost me the faith community of my youth. But in our digital interconnected world, there are communities for everybody, whether it's online or in whatever city you might be in. And this is a spiritual revolution that I don't think is being reported on that much, but it is happening in every corner of our world and every corner of the internet. And that gets me hopeful that the next generation will not have as much religious trauma as my generation and before.
Yeah, I mean, I hope they won't. I imagine there will be some new horrible thing that comes along because I some days feel like more of a pessimist than I want to. But I will also hold on to hope that that is not the case. And I'm curious as I'm thinking too about just the way we were raised in churches, in families, in communities with Bible stories that were distilled down with a memory verse for each of us or a felt story in Sunday school that says, here's what this means, period. And in going through your book, you spent several chapters addressing stories that are often used as justification for anti-queer theology. But your work isn't just challenging and saying, no, they're wrong. You're offering a very deep and life-giving exploration of those stories. And so I won't ask you to go through all of them by any means, but I'm curious what you're hoping that readers will come away with as they revisit those texts for themselves or even for someone else through that
Yeah,
lens of liberation.
thank you for that. I mean, I think so many people that I talk to that have deconstructed and have religious trauma are really fearful of the Bible and of like worship experiences. And they're the two things that trigger people most quickly. But I also think the things that trigger us sometimes can be also a path to healing if we can find a different way to relate to them. I would recommend any deconstructed Christian or Christian on the edge of deconstruction to look into the Jewish tradition. And I reference it so often in my book, and it's in my own life what has kind of saved my faith. The tradition from which Christianity emerges is so much more expansive, so much more creative. Um, the Jewish tradition has always said that the Bible does not have a static meaning, but has a different meaning, layers of meaning within each text and even each word. If you look at like the Talmud, which is the book of Jewish interpretation from ancient rabbis arguing about different texts, there are literally hundreds of different interpretations that are all seen as legitimate and authoritative of a simple word or a Bible passage. Every person should be empowered to read the Bible from the lens of their own experience and to ask if you're viewing the Bible as some sort of spiritual or divine book. I would invite you to ask God to speak through the story to your experience through your lens. And what I mean by that is this. There's a great tradition called liberation theology, and I often quote James Cone, who is one of the great Black liberation theologians in America. He wrote a book called The Cross and the Lynching Tree, where he read the story of Jesus as a Black man in the civil rights era of America and a little bit before that. And so much of Jesus' story jumped out to him as parallel to the Black experience in America with lynching and anti-Black laws. And what happened for James Cone in that movement was that Jesus became a liberator. The Bible became a healing text, a guidebook. Insights about Jesus' story jumped out in a way that they would never jump out to a white person reading that text with no context. So in my book, I invite queer people. I put on my queer lens of my queer experience of the world, and I read some of the familiar texts of the scripture and say, what jumps out to me? What might God be saying? What might our ancestors be saying to a queer person who's reading this text? And I'll just say, my favorite story and one that really transformed me was reading Joseph. Many people will know it as Joseph in the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. Many scholars have said for a long time the coat that Joseph wears, Hebrew word, kanet pasim, is actually women's dress, is what that word means in Hebrew. So there's always been some ambiguity about why is Joseph wearing a woman's garment? What does this mean? And then when I read it with a fully queer lens, what it became was a story of a father. Joseph's father gives him this dress of many colors, knowing that it will make him a pariah in his society. And in fact, Joseph is attempted to be killed multiple times in the text because of his flamboyancy. And yet the father's love for Joseph continues, and the father continues to support and help Joseph move forward. And eventually, Joseph flourishes and becomes one of the great leaders of Israel. And from a queer lens, for the first time, I said, this is a story of a father with a queer child doing the right thing and helping his queer child stand up against bullying and oppression. Didn't save him from the bullying. We all will experience that. But it shows how powerful the support and affirmation of a parent might be. And I just thought, if we taught that in Sunday school, how many parents would be more well prepared to deal with not only their LGBT youth, but any child that is a little bit different or doesn't fit in? That's the magic and the beauty, I think, of the Bible is that it has this layers of wisdom, but you can only see it when you choose to read it or listen to it from another's perspective and allow that perspective to let the story unfold. And the Jewish tradition has been doing that for nearly 4,000 years. Christians did it for 1,500 years. And it's only been in the last 1,500 years or so that we've started to see this development of there's only one right interpretation, which is a ridiculous way to try to read a library of books like the Bible.
It's a ridiculous way to read Charles Dickens. It's a
Yeah,
ridiculous way to read any author. What a random reference of all the people I could have written about, said out
I
in
love
that
it.
moment. It's a different way to read Dr. Seuss, right? You're
Um,
always going to put your own lens and understanding over the top of the text in front of you, and to immediately invalidate someone's takeaway because you're not them and they're not you and they're different is a spiritually immature thing to do,
mm,
let alone that's what we're teaching our young children about how to, oh, that's their opinion, right? And
yeah,
allowing kids to have an opinion that they don't like broccoli, but all the other kids in the family do. So this child must be wrong. I could go down that road forever. I
yeah.
love that idea because it's such a kind and generous way to identify our lives are all incredibly unique. Our experiences are different. It's what we talk about in grief work all the time. It's a very complicated field because there is no formula, there is no process, there's no pathologizing grief in a way that then brings an end to the
Yeah.
experience for someone who's going through multiple things at once. And actually that's kind of where I wanted to go with my next question is when we know we are already grieving the loss of a community because we don't feel like we have belonging, and we're dealing with the loss of relationships to the individuals in that community, and we're dealing with the loss of parasocial relationships, perceived connection to people that maybe we haven't met yet in that community. You have layers and layers, not to mention any other kind of death or illness or anything else that's left us in that time frame. Now we're addressing our own identity as well. And that comes along with any kind of grief. A secondary loss of identity is honestly very expected. But when this level of intensity of our identity is challenged, how might your work really speak to those individuals who are carrying such layered grief, who are wrestling with what belonging means to them and what it looks like going forward?
Yeah. I mean, what I tell folks is there's often a real push to want to jump out of the closet. When you're ready, you're ready. When you've done your own inner work, you're ready. And I advise against that 99.9% of the time because I think we can conceptualize what it looks like losing a community or being disconnected from family or having to form a new identity. And that part can sound exciting and life-giving. And yet, I know just from my own experience that the process involves a lot of grief. The loss slows you down in a way that you don't expect it. Again, like when I was ready to, by the time I was getting rejected by my Bible college, I didn't really buy into the theology anymore. I was already three-fourths of the way out the door. But it's a whole different thing to then finally be told, you are no longer welcome here. You've never been part of us. You're not truly saved. I didn't believe any of those paradigms, and yet those still hold so much subconscious weight. So I just always tell people, like, take your time, make sure you're finding a new community. You don't need a new church if that's not where you want to go. What's beautiful about the queer community, and I think all communities have this, but in my experience in the queer community, there are so many amazing places that have popped up for folks to gather in different contexts in different ways. As I was coming out, it was actually a gay kickball team that became like my first place to have a community that could support me as I was losing everything. And I think that in many ways saved my life to have a space that I could go to that was new. And there's all the anxiety about joining new groups of people, sure. But if you don't have a new place to move to, I don't think it's safe or psychologically smart to separate, even there are degrees of toxicity and things like that that you might need to do that faster. But if you have the ability to take your time, start doing the work to build at least a foundation of some sort of community to move towards. And then the other thing is many people do, queer people feel the need to leave religion behind altogether. And I get that impulse. And again, I stepped away from religion as a pastor for a couple of years. I needed it. But we live in a world today where most people don't recognize that nearly every major mainline denomination in this country is fully affirming of LGBT people. The average person doesn't know that on the street. And there are rich, progressive, rich meaning theologically and culturally
Yes.
rich, progressive churches in nearly every city that have people that have walked this journey. I've especially benefited from my relationships to queer elders in churches that have done this work in a much more difficult context. And to have them be guides is something that has been invaluable in my own journey. And so I just say, like, to have mentors, progressive faith communities can be some of the best places to do that. Even if it's not where you stay and it's not your long-term home and you choose not to be a Christian, that's fine and legitimate. But it's a built-in community with people who know how to support you. So all of what I'm just saying is make sure you build a community before you step out. And I promise once you have that, everything else will start to fall into place. You're still going to have the highs and lows. You're still going to feel rejection. You're still going to have the psychological anxiety of are you wrong and are you walking away from God? But if you've got a group that can hold you, you're going to be okay. I really believe that.
So much of this reminds me of when I was in college, and I don't want to. This is, I'm sharing this not because it's about my story by any means. I haven't experienced any kind of exclusion around my sexual identity. So there's that. But it reminds me about the transition we go through in every experience of big life changes when we're moving away to college and we're having this entirely new community around us, new influences every single day, new inputs. Most of the time, however, we have that safe landing place of our family of origin, theoretically, or our high school teachers who helped us apply for college in the first place. There's often still a connective thread back into what feels like safety, what felt familiar once upon a time. And I think that that's part of where people who are experiencing exclusion because of their queer identity are a struggle to communicate with someone who doesn't understand. Like, as you were saying, I love that there was a gay kickball team for you to go to because it made me giggle and think about what fun. And too bad I couldn't play with them because that would be such a joyful experience.
Come hang
Totally.
out anytime.
But that's my point. You'll have people who say, well, why do you need a gay kickball club? Why can't you just go play kickball? Because there
Mm,
is less and less likelihood of a connective thread back to safety and back to belonging where you can still be who you are. It has nothing to do with sexual identity to play kickball. It has everything to do with my husband is wearing a little blue balloon pin to say, like, hey, I'm a safe person to talk to in general. Just, I am not going to rip you to shreds if we disagree. I'm not going to cause you any harm. And that's all it is. It's a signal of like, you can trust,
mm,
even though you don't know me, that I will do my best to create psychological safety in this space. And I think that it's underrated because everyone is skeptical and afraid and dealing with their own hurts. And I get that. But I also think that it is one of those beautiful pieces, like you were saying, about the next generation that's coming up that has an opportunity to do it differently so that there is an assumption of safety instead of an assumption of scarcity and of suspicion over
yeah.
these communities that we want to build.
Yeah. And just to that point, a soapbox that I'll get on is just this queer spaces, I understand, are very scary for people as they're coming out, especially coming out as a Christian. But some of the most psychologically healing and hopeful places for me have been where I'll be tonight, honestly, later on a Friday night, in the gay nightclub, a place where I can show up and know that 75% of the people in the room with me have religious trauma in their background. Half of them are pastors' kids, in my experience. Like, it's so beautiful to have these kind of spaces, as you're saying, that are what the church was for me, right? The church, evangelical church, I knew no matter where I went in the country, if I went to a particular brand of evangelical church, there'd be people that I knew or knew of. They'd have the same Bible verses, we'd sing the same songs, we'd dress the same way. And that is a real sense of comfort, even if you're going away to college, for instance. You know, if you join intervarsity at college, you're going to have a home base, right? Queer spaces are still so important, and I really encourage folks that are just coming out to like dip their toe. Whether it's a nightclub or not is up to you. There are queer book clubs and coffee shops and kickball teams. But these spaces have become for me like the evangelical church was. No matter where I go in the world, if I show up, I know I'm going to find people with common stories, common experiences, common traumas, and that is so healing, that is so liberating, and that has given me so much life and empowered so much of my work. So, just a little PSA to anybody on the way out of the closet. I know it's scary to step into these spaces, but I promise you, some of the best healing that I've done outside of therapy has been just being myself in a space where there are 10 other people that have their own version of my religious trauma, and you can find it in virtually every city in this country.
And what you just said is so poignant too. The idea that I can walk into this environment and have a general sense of agreement and safety and connection with people. That doesn't mean there won't be wild cards who are dangerous or reckless. That's every community, everywhere, always. That's like walking into a hospital and thinking every doctor is absolutely expert at what they do. Um, but it made me think about when I was young and thought, gosh, I could travel the world and go to different Sunday church services everywhere I go, and it would feel like home. And I say that with such a annoying voice to me personally, because that's really what it was. That naive belief of I can belong anywhere is actually real. Like that is the authentic belonging that we have been created with, a sense of purpose and a sense of identity that says I can be fully who I am wherever I go, and I can be treated with respect and dignity and have my human nature honored without degradation or dehumanization just for existing differently.
Yeah.
That's all we want,
Mm.
right?
Yeah. And
Mm.
it's there. I know, again, I know that loss when you're leaving the traditional Christian community. You feel like you will never find that again. And it does take time because I mean, I spent 15 years in the church before I was outed and pushed away. That's a lot of investment into a community, right? And it's taken me a decade to be like this thriving queer person, but it's worth it. And there is another way to be Christian. There's another way to be spiritual. There are different ways to be queer. And I think that's the best part about the coming out experience, and that I think queer people can actually teach straight folks is this ability to be reborn often later in life and to unveil your true self and to have a second adolescence. I've just been seeing more and more straight folks that I feel like you need a second adolescence. You need a second ability to take off the masks and explore your true self. That is the gift of coming out. It comes with a lot of pain. I think of Jesus saying dying to self, like that costs a lot. It hurts. But you rise to new life, and there's a new way of seeing and being in the world on the other side of coming out as queer. And I think for all of us, when we're willing to confront the black and white way we saw the world, relinquish that, and embrace the complexity and the beauty of the expansive universe we find ourselves in.
Brandon, it's so beautiful. I've just so enjoyed talking with you today. And I'm curious if the listeners don't end up picking up your book, or even if they do, if they could just take one thing from what you've shared or your journey, especially those who are grieving their place in the world right now, what's the one thing you want them to remember?
Yeah, I mentioned it earlier, and I think you've mentioned this is a paradigm you use, but it is the one message that sums up the entirety of my faith and the work I do in the world. It's that there is no fear in love. So whenever you find yourself being made to feel afraid for a belief that you have for your identity, that is never from God. The scripture says God casts out all fear. If you're not being motivated by love, and if you are not receiving love, and if you're in a space that is causing you more fear than love, you need to know that that is not a generative, God filled space in my theological paradigm, and that in a community where you are finally embraced, in a space where you feel free to be who you are, that is where love can flourish. That is when you can become the channel of blessing and healing to the world. It will never be in the paradigm of fear. And so learn to recognize fear and love and choose the path of love. And I promise you'll have the spiritual, abundant life Jesus talked about, if that's your tradition, or just a whole and meaningful life if you choose to walk in the way of love over fear.
Brandon, thank you so much for making space with me today and for sharing your story and sharing about this incredible work that you've been creating in the world, because it is very, very necessary. If you're listening, his latest book is titled Queer and Christian: Reclaiming the Bible, Our Faith, and Our Place at the Table. It is available anywhere you get your books. I'm a big fan of thriftbooks.com and bookstore.org personally. And if you want to reach out and hear more about Brandon's work, you can reach out to him on social media. Where do you love to interact with people the most?
Yeah, the best way to find me is brandanrobertson.com. All my social media is there, and you can email me and message me. I am happy to try to be a resource if I can be on your journey. So,
I love it. Thank you, Brandon. You are a gift.
likewise, thank you for having me. It's been so beautiful.
Thank you for listening to episode 207 of Restorative Grief. We started the conversation naming that a faith practice centered on love results in the freedom to explore and expand with the mystery of all that is and might be. And honestly, the same can be said of a grief practice. A grief practice or grief work that centers on love allows us to expand and contract as needed, to explore what might be possible for us on the other side of loss, and to lean in what feels okay and safe in the moment so that long term we develop an understanding of what belonging really means to us. Pick up a copy of Brandon's latest work and his many other good books at bookstore.org or thriftbooks.com, and be sure to leave a review wherever you purchase. You can check out the show notes for more details or visit brandanrobertson.com to connect with him and his work. If you're not already a patron of this show or a follower of my work on Instagram, what are you waiting for? Come connect with me at Mandy Capehart or at mandykapehart.com, and let's talk through all the expansion and confusion together, because as awkward and uncomfortable as it can be, it's worth it every single time. And if you like what you heard today, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and leave a review before you press pause. That helps us find our audience, and let me tell you, they need us just as much as we need them. And as always, before we go, one last thing. Please remember, the only solution for grief is to do the work of grieving. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next week.